Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kish.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
Yeah, I know. Hold on, Marcus. I'm trying to listen. Okay.
I'm having my drink then.
Okay, I need to go back. I'm sorry. Sorry about that, Marcus. Listening is not always my strong suit. But take over. Who's on the show
sure,
today?
especially if you're in the middle of a podcast recording and you're on your phone. Pretending so much. God, there's a clown lost in that man.
Who's on the show today?
We have Janie van Hool today and her book called The Listening Shift, which is, as you can maybe imagine, about shift and a lot of listening. So that's the title. That's the name. What's your takeaway from it?
A couple of really great takeaways. I mean, number one, it was just a whole lot of fun. I think the three of us really, really enjoyed it, and the time just sort of flew by. And I think we did a pretty good job, at least I hope so, of listening to each other throughout the entire thing, which was good. I think her big thing initially was curiosity is so important to doing good listening. And I think it's a really, really important point. Because if you're curious and you're actually paying attention to what the other person is saying, you're a much more active listener, as opposed to knowing what the answer is and waiting for a break in the speech to jump in. And the other one, I think a lot of times people can tell when they're not being told everything. And there are some senior leaders in the C-suite who can't tell you everything about the business. But her viewpoint on that was what leaders can say is, here's when certainty will be possible, whether it's in 6 weeks' time or at the end of the next quarter or whatever. And it's understanding and communicating to the people who are in the room, look, I know you don't know everything. I can't tell you everything. And this is how it usually makes me feel in those situations. So being present and relating. Tell us more about what were your big takeaways.
Yeah. So, it was a really great interview because, I missed it. I don't remember if it's in the book, but, she seemingly was originally trained as an actor and started doing Shakespeare in Iraq or something like that, which is hilarious and interesting. So it was interesting how she fell into that job of consulting C-level people. What I really liked about it is that even so, it's listening where when you would describe it's like, well, one person is talking and the other one is sitting there not saying anything and listening. Actually, it takes two to listen, and it takes two to be active about listening, and not just active listening, but then therefore there's a couple of things on the listening end you should really be doing. And some things are, to reconfirm what someone just said, or the other things to make someone feel comfortable enough to try to put things into words when they're not 100% sure that they might say the right thing or the wrong thing or describe it in a right way or a wrong way, So taking the fear out of that and creating this, that it's okay not to say the smartest thing in the room or something like that, but just to bring out a notion or something. So the comfort is really important, and letting people talk, and maybe, and I know that from the creative process to fish a little bit for go a level deeper into what they actually really mean or why they say what they say, to really dig a bit more into what the underlying thing is. I think in particular when we're looking at problem solving, it's really super important because people often just talk about the symptoms and they're actually not themselves really aware of the real problem that's underlying. So the listening has it takes two to listen, and the second part that we might imagine is the silent part. It shouldn't just be silent. There's actually action required on that side too. So that was my big takeaway there, that it's not a one-way street.
Yeah, and to our listeners, I mean, our audience, you are listening to us either during your workout or on a run, or listening to us in the background while you're cooking dinner. But at the moment, you're probably tired of just listening to Troy and Marcus. So why don't we go and let you listen to Janie as well? Marcus, let's go.
Before the interview, a quick word from our very first sponsor, Zencaster. We use Zencaster for all our audio and video recording, and it's a very nifty tool that splits up all the channels for very easy editing. Zencaster is used by 10% of all active podcasts. You can get 40% off the first 3 months and unlimited audio and video recordings with our special coupon code wickedpodcast. I repeat, wickedpodcast for 40% off. And now the interview. Hello, everyone. Today we're here with Janie van Hool. Hey, Janie. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So we've all been giggling before recording, so let's keep it light and fun. Let's start at the top as usual. Please tell our listeners, please, who you are and why you wrote the book.
I am a leadership communication specialist. I began that work as a bit of a backwards route. I started out my life as a classical actor. I trained to do Shakespeare, and my first job was in Iraq in a theater in Baghdad. So I've had a an interesting path to where I am now. But essentially, after about 12 years of working as an actor, I was taking a master's degree in voice. And intending fully to still work in the entertainment business. But then I had a wonderful chance encounter on a beach in Norfolk with a woman who was head of management development for a bank. And she asked me if I'd be willing to work with the chief exec of the bank, who wasn't a great speaker communicator. And, I'd had a couple of beers, and I was feeling very pleased with myself. And I said, yeah, of course I can do that, no problem. And then a couple of days later, when she followed up, and the icy hand of fear gripped my heart, but actually, I'd committed by then. So I did it, but it just changed my life. It turned out to be, I realized that I am a teacher. I just love helping people shine. I love helping people be the best of themselves as communicators. So for the last 20 years, I've worked in just all sorts of organizations with leaders on how they communicate, perhaps strategy, how they speak at conferences, how they communicate in the media. But that's a lot about talking. But in my volunteering life, I volunteer for an organization called the Samaritans, which is a UK charity. We listen, we have conversations with people who are in distress. And I learned so much about listening when I joined the Samaritans. And I realized that actually, even though a lot of the themes of my life have been about listening, no one had ever actually taught me how to do it. And I realized that we're all taught how to speak, but we're not taught how to listen. We're just told to listen. So that I suddenly thought, God, as a leader, it's surely got to be the most important thing to make people feel heard, acknowledged, understood. And thank you, pandemic, I found that I had the time to write the book. And it's been quite a journey.
Mm, most certainly. So I have to give you, high marks on your ability to use play on words. I mean,
Thank you.
the title of the book, "The Listening Shift," and it's time to get shift done. And I really like the variety that you used on that to play on that.
Thank
Um,
you. Thank
you
you.
were
It
talking about
does. It's a great word. It lends itself to so many different perspectives.
it does. I want to tell you my own personal story. Back in 1992 and 1993, I had a friend. Well, there were four of us that would go to the pub and have long-winded conversations about all manner of things, largely about shift, if you know what I mean. Uh,
I
and
do.
one night, Carolyn was a deaf. She was hearing when she was born. 7 years old, went on a flight with an ear infection, and she lost her hearing.
Oh, good God.
And she said, listen, you guys are always thinking about what you're going to say next, and you've stopped listening after the first two or three sentences. I don't have that privilege. I have to read your lips. I actually have to be engaged all the way through until you finish your thought. And sometimes I find because I waited, I actually agree with you because I let you finish the thought. And that's been one of my big kind of learning life lessons about listening is like, okay, I know I want to say something, but stop and really finish and let them finish. How does that kind of play into some of the other lessons that you've learned or that you teach in a leadership scenario?
Oh, well, I mean, what a gift for hearing that from a friend and being able to understand that, because um, uh, it is the single biggest challenge for all of us. I talk about this in the book, trying not to listen to solve, trying to stay with someone else's thought. And I just want to say about communicating with someone who has suffered a hearing loss as well. The expressivity, the clarity with which you can read the emotion, whether that's online or face to face, actually, but the investment that a deaf person will put into communicating is such a beautiful thing to watch. And so there's so much to learn from that. But of course, in organizations, we are time poor. We're always in a rush. Everybody wants to be seen as the person that's making a contribution. So meetings are full of people who either don't shut up or people who can't actually get in. And then we don't seem to notice, well, someone said, oh, they seemed quiet today. But, I think we just are not paying enough attention generally. And that's a big problem for leaders. It's a big problem in organizations.
How is it with then, apart from that, and I'm not even going to talk about maybe Kahneman's thinking fast and slow and sort of digesting information differently, but I got a story too. So I run a lot of workshops in my line of work, and so you have 15, 20 people or more in a room that you need to understand, then you need to find out things about. And there's sometimes, or back in when physical spaces were still a thing, it's very draining. You do that for a whole day or maybe two, and it's very, very draining. So after a whole day of listening, my brain is still tired. But I'm quite used to it, and it's okay. However, I was in Barcelona a couple of years back in a conference, and they did was probably active listening session or something like that, something I never had done quite before, and it had just two sets of rules in it. One was that you needed to first repeat what the other person had just said to see that if you understood it or phrase it in your own words, and then you could contribute only in a way with something that you have personally experienced. So not something that you read somewhere or you think, right? Actually something that really came from your own experience. And that was only going on for half an hour, and I had a headache after that. So even for people who are more into, by job, listening, and maybe that muscle is trained better, it's still hard work. How do you train this up then to say, right, we have to spend more energy on this? How much energy can we though expect from people therefore?
I mean, it's such a great point. I think what I've noticed myself, particularly when I've been doing listening sessions for Samaritans, it's absolutely the hardest work that you can do, because to bring your whole self and pay attention and also not judge, also not do that thing of going, oh, I know where this is going, or oh, what an idiot, or all that stuff. It is exhausting. So that was part of the principle for me of thinking in shifts. And I'm a huge advocate of people being a bit more open with each other, not that typically British perhaps, but I think we need to say to people, do you know what? I'm really tired at the moment and I don't know how well I'm going to be able to listen. Is there a better time for this conversation? Or if it's a really important conversation, take some time to get yourself in a place where you are going to be able to listen well. If you've been sitting down all day, move a bit, change your body position, or have something to eat, or have something to drink, or take in a few lungfuls of air from outside. Write down what's on your mind. Anything you can do that just gets yourself ready to listen. Because if you're on your phone, looking at your watch, thinking about what to have for supper, it's just not going to happen.
Hmm.
And that's not doing anybody any service. You've got to be able to say, I'm just not really in this conversation, or just set the
So that's
conditions.
that's the self management. That's the being authentic. That's being vulnerable. It's being expressive. about whether you're too tired to engage or whether you're really wanting someone to make them more selves available to engage. But in worlds of endless meetings, whether we're talking about around a conference table or in around the tiles in a Zoom, I think there's an important role of a facilitator. And the facilitator has to read not just the individuals, but to read the room, to draw certain people out, to maybe kind of tone certain people back. And you've got
Yep.
all of these different personalities. And I said in one of the questions, you've got the charisma effect, that everyone is desperate to hear this person speak because when they speak, the world stops. And you've got everyone else feeling really, really self-conscious, or not everyone, but some people feeling very self-conscious, saying, well, I've got things to say, but I'm not going to deliver them in a way that I'm ever going to be heard. Where does the role of the facilitator sit in your work?
I mean, crucial. It's so important to have somebody in that role, some kind of bystander, somebody that's kind of, I call it a choreographer, really, or you might say a conductor, someone who can balance the proceedings. And I think again that's another shift. You know, we need to acknowledge that actually when something is unstructured, we really do need someone in that role to make sure that every voice is heard, particularly in this push for a more diversity of thinking in our conversations. So I think that's a hugely important role. The other thing is that, particularly if you feel that you're not, I don't know, the most charismatic or strongest voice in the room, actually Zoom meetings are a little bit more helpful because you do have the tech reactions buttons to offer a contribution, or you can make a comment as someone is talking endlessly in a chat box. You know, you can be more participative in that way, but I think a lot of work is also done in relationship building before meetings. Like if I was in a particularly tough meeting and I was worried about being heard, I would probably build some allyship before the meeting. I would go to people and say, I'm really worried about whether I'm going to be able to make a contribution here. Can I rely on your support? Can you ask me? Can you draw me in? And you know, do a little bit of foundation laying before you find yourself in those situations, because otherwise people just, you know, they just check out. You can used to be able to see in the face-to-face environments, you could see people sort of sitting back, staring out the window, slumped. But I think that's a little bit harder on Zoom because you can't see the full picture, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, again, when you look at more complex and maybe more aware formats beyond meetings and conversations that you usually have in offices or companies, whenever you go into a workshop or you go into customer research, something, interviews, right? So interviews, you never try to go in there alone because you want a scribe, right? Because you're in the flow, you're not paying attention. So you need one who can scribe, can look at the time, and then basically nudge that. And it's the same for workshops. You do, someone is leading and talking, and then someone else is supporting and sort of picking up on things that
Yeah.
when someone's in the flow doesn't pick up on. So how do you so when you have multiple people in the room and everyone's supposed to, be able to speak and be able to listen, how do you get around people then not being concise and therefore taking up more time, and then sort of being nice to say no, or pointing out that someone else hasn't talked or contributed? And how this works? How do you go around these in very practical sense?
I mean, I think this is a really interesting one, actually, because we all talk, or certainly I've been talking in my book about the importance of listening. But actually, you're right. There are some people who just really enjoy holding forth and you know, take the lion's share of attention in a meeting. I was really pleased when I was researching for my book to discover that there are different perceptions of interruption. So
Mm-hmm.
there's what's known as disruptive interruptions, which is essentially saying, what you shut up, I want to talk about what I want to talk about. So obviously that's kind of, you know, seizing the conversation and is not appreciated. But there's also what we call cooperative interruptions, where you might interrupt someone simply to enthusiastically support and encourage or help in some way. And And I've noticed that that can work very well because it's quite flattering to affirm what someone is saying. And if they're speaking at length and you go, I'm so sorry to interrupt because I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And I think you've hit on something. I noticed that, Ramesh said something earlier, blah, blah, blah. Can we go back to that? So if you're in a facilitative role or if you give yourself that role, you can break in without causing too much upset. And in fact, if anything, you may find that that person appreciates it.
Yeah, but I also know that people have totally abused yes and.
Oh, yeah, don't they? Wow.
I listened
Yes.
to a couple of
Yes
boys.
and, or
Just say yes
yes, can I build
and
on
it was
that?
difficult.
You know what? That is so frustrating because as an actor, that's one of the foundations of improvising. That's the principle, right? And then organizations go, "Oh, right, so you just can't say but." That's not really to get it.
Yeah.
Not really the point.
Not really, no. I mean, the other thing is then, of course, it might be not in that moment, but it might be again worth an offline conversation where you say, I noticed that you have so many contributions to make. And actually, the other thing I notice is other people are not able to contribute equally. And I'm wondering what we can do about that. I mean, we've just got to be a bit braver. Actually, I'm an advocate of people reviewing at the end of a meeting how they behaved in the meeting. I just think that would be really useful. How did I listen? How did I connect? What kind of questions did I ask? Wouldn't it be great if we just had the confidence to nudge ourselves forward by doing that? But of course, people don't really want to.
Well,
Not always.
it's super interesting because literally on Monday we had another recording around with a consultant who's using horses to talk a lot about nonverbal communication. So she brings teams to the horses, and then depending on the horses pick up on certain things, it tells a lot about how people also perceive you when you approach them and the way you are.
Yeah.
Super interesting. And
I
then
mean, that because it's that emotional experience, isn't it? Do I trust you?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
What is it about you that I trust?
Yeah,
I
and some
know that
people
one.
can come in very imposing, and you go, "Oh, okay, I'll kind of step back to start with, kind of thing." But yeah, so the other thing I wanted to ask, and it's actually not something, it's something that popped into my head when we're talking about improvisation and we're talking about adding to a conversation or having a different point. I'm saying this a little bit because I'm quite nerdily a fanboy for people like Stephen Colbert, who grew up around improvisation and so on, over in was Second City or wherever he came from. And the how does that flow in comparison? Is that something to learn from? Sort of that you have a conversation that is listening, and I think somewhere in the book you say acting is actually a lot more listening than speaking. Is that is there anything you learned there that contributes to the flow of listening and having a conversation about something? Because improvisation must be amazing, where you have absolutely nothing, or just people throw you a couple of words. That's all you're going in with, and then you just play on these things. Because I have this a lot in my job when I am dropped into an organization that I don't fully understand, or within a couple of days I'll need to figure out what's going on. I need to bounce a lot of things off and test things, and that feels somewhat similar. Is there something you learned there that contributes to what you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think all organizations should have improvisation lessons because in fact, I spoke to an improvising teacher. Actually, I learned a lot from him over the years. Called Dave Bourne, who he started doing improvisation because he was suffering from anxiety. Interestingly, and he talks about communication being a dance and says it's got to be 50-50. The thing is, if you're planning ahead, if you've decided what you're I mean, for example, you sent me a list of questions that you might want to talk about. We don't think we've really touched on them yet because you're in the moment, and so you're improvising, literally going, oh, that's interesting, I'll go down that path. And it is a core skill for anybody that wants to communicate because you have no idea what's coming. You have to be fearless, but if you have no idea what the person is going to do or say next, you can only respond to what you're offered. And that means if you plot ahead, it's going to fall flat because the other person doesn't know what you've planned. So it's a muscle to flex, but so valuable for teaching presence. And presence is about, I spent years being asked to work with leaders on their presence, but actually presence is about being in the moment so that you can really respond or bring whatever is, in your own toolkit to bear on a situation.
I found a lot in there. It's actually often less the knowledge that you really have, and it's more sort of the excitement you have for knowledge and what other people have to give, right? And it's probably driving me into being in these projects where I know, or I like to pretend to know next to nothing. I just ask questions, and then you do this thing, and it's interesting because of my design or creative background. This is how ideas work as well. You throw a couple of anchors on, you try a couple of things, like, oh, how about this? How about this? As a creative, so in the advertising, marketing industry, creative industry, you do that all the time. You throw out a lot of things because you want to explore and maybe understand or maybe try things. So
Yeah.
that's given, and as long as everyone knows it, no one has fear of saying the wrong thing. Whereas I found a lot in the business context, that fear is there because it's all about, oh, you got to say the right thing because that's gonna be the solution, right? And they jump on the first thing, and the first thing I see, or the way I see it, that's the thing that we're not going to talk about. Instead of, well, here's an idea. How do you create that as well? Because I can imagine in terms of listening, it must be very often that when you listen, you might not in the beginning know where someone is going with it. So how can you keep them then feel safe enough so that they're willing to maybe not get it right when they explain things, but are open enough to explore?
I mean, I think curiosity is key, isn't it? I think that's the thing for us all to work on. And to that end, I think we need to learn to ask. Ironically, I've written a book about listening, but actually, one of the ways that helps us listen is to have the other person talk about something that's interesting. So we should ask better questions. I've been working a lot lately with people on Zoom who are concerned about their um, team's well-being. And I say to them, how are you investigating how people are? And they say, we always start a call by saying, how are you? And the thing with the question, how are you, is, I mean, you probably would respond with, yeah, I'm good, thanks, or fine, thanks. And it's just,
Especially in England, yeah, I'm all right.
yeah, God, absolutely. It's just, we don't even, it's like, how do you get into a conversation if you don't say, how are you? Yeah, I'm good, thanks. But that's not going to give you the data that you want. You've got to ask a better question. You've got to say, so tell me what's going on for you this week so that you're getting more data and more information. And someone really believes that you're interested instead of the cursory, how are you? So I think if there's anything to work on, it's how can I be a bit more curious? And of course, certainty is the death charge for curiosity. If I think I know, if you look all right to me, I probably won't ask you how you are, but actually I should ask because I don't know. So I love your approach of I don't know, because it's only by asking curious questions that you'll find out.
And for me, sometimes it's starting off with my own vulnerability.
Mm.
This week I have really been struggling trying to get a mortgage for a place we're trying to buy in Portugal. And I feel like I've been beating my head against the wall. That's what my week has been about. What's going on for you in your week? And by setting the frame of being open and transparent, I've given them a frame in which they may or may not be able to respond.
Yeah. I mean, that's brilliant because you're setting up that the conversation is about revealing, not concealing. You've set the tone, and certainly in leadership, I know it doesn't suit everybody to share very deeply, but you can always give something away that tells other people this is not just a how are you? Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Okay, what have we got to do today? Which is
Right. So Marcus was referring to Jude Jennison and her book Opus, which was the book that we were reading before. And she uses horses and how, whether it's horses, whether it's people, we read body language. We read the unspoken. We listen with our eyes as much as we do, with our ears.
yeah.
And I had a question that I put into the list of things for us to discuss today around leaders, especially C-suite leaders, who either choose not or cannot reveal certain things about a merger or an acquisition that's currently in the way, or the quarterly reports that's going to be either amazing or it's going to be terrible, or the fact that the HR director is the one that's going to get the sack next. And yet people know when they're not being told everything.
Yeah.
So how do you listen and give some people some room to say, yeah, I know they're not telling me, but there may be a good reason?
Yeah. I mean, I think that number one, you know, we don't expect to know everything that the leadership know, but what we do crave is a bit of certainty. So it might be that you say in any of those situations, I can't tell you everything right now, but at the end of this 6 week period, we will be able to give a really clear picture. So that's number one, a bit of as much certainty as you can. The second thing is to ask people how they're feeling if they feel like they don't have the complete picture, because that will be a range of emotions. Some will feel betrayed or cheated, some will just be apathetic, they won't care. Some people will be angry, some people will be worried, you know, so let them feel listened to and acknowledged. The other thing is a bit more cynical, which is chuck them a morsel if you can, give them a little something, because in influencing research we know that the law of scarcity is very appealing. uh, I, I once saw one of our very senior leaders, who shall remain nameless, say to an audience of 10,000 people, I shouldn't be telling you this, but you can see everybody leaning in and going, oh, hello, what are we about to get here? And so there's that sense of being included.
Mm.
So even if you phrase something in that way, that can also be very helpful. Um, and this is not cynical actually, but appreciate them for their patience, appreciate them for their understanding, thank them for bearing with you. You know, and that can also take a long way, especially if you can say, you know, a bit like you were just sharing, you know, if you can say, I've been where you are, I know what it's like when you're living in this uncertainty, and this is how I felt, and I don't know if that's your experience, but you know, I promise you, as soon as I can tell you with anything definitive, I will.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we had one book a couple of weeks ago, especially about sort of late night sessions with CEO, where someone was able to, often quite at late times, with a beverage or something, who was able to talk to C-level leaders and saying, look, all those stories, you finally found them where, the things they normally can't talk about. It's just not possible because of their position.
Yeah.
And, they need to basically make everyone feel safe and fine and, kind of being hopeful.
Yeah.
And it's very taxing on them often. And so he had some very interesting conversations as well about, how vulnerable they still are. And there's a whole discussion about the more humble, vulnerable, supportive
Mm.
leader. And we'll see where this goes. However, as usual, we have more questions than time, so I'll bring the last one in. Yes.
But also, we're going to throw in one more. We need to know, how do we communicate when one of our best friends rambles incessantly? And
You know,
we really want your advice on this one. We won't name any names, of course.
sharing is caring. So
You can celebrate your difference of approach.
we did. There's probably a reason why this podcast is so amazingly successful
There
and
you go.
by millions of people. Um,
Sorry, come on with your last question now.
yeah. So let's bring it right back to COVID at the end. So what do you think you saw there for sort of the biggest differences now with COVID world? And we can talk a bit about how listening works in the Zoom land, or in general, sort of, people feeling comfortable enough to be able to talk. And we know that Zoom meetings have kind of increased by 20-30% on average in all the companies. So people are drained and whatnot. So there's all that. What did you find to sort of make it sense?
I think what I was pleased to see early on was how much people wanted to help each other.
Mhm.
So people were having Zoom meetings that, they would play games or make pizza together or have kind of party nights. And that does seem to have fallen by the wayside as the pressures have increased. My own view, and this is backed up by some research, is that people are a little bit more compassionate, actually, generally, but also less patient. So whether that means they will engage in a conversation to say, so tell me what's going on for you, but actually, if you have to keep having that conversation, then their rope is shorter. They don't um, want to keep having the same conversation. My big concern is that as we go back out into the workplace, and we're in this kind of hybrid environment, some people will be online, some people will be in the workplace. My concern is that we will have less rich relationships, that people will stick in their little groups, and that people who are online when some people are in live meetings, that's such a skill. I mean, you'll know as facilitators yourself, but if you're in a room with people and there are also people online, it is a real skill to include everybody and make sure everyone feels heard, involved. And I don't know if companies will be willing to invest in that, because I don't see that they've invested that much in helping people communicate really powerfully online. So interesting times for communication, I think, coming up. I'm worried it'll become very transactional, and that we'll live in sort of little echo chambers and not really connect across silos, across the business, across teams, because I think we've lost that a little bit over what is now quite a long period.
I think that's a great insight, and I think it's really interesting to see that, because I don't think enough people say exactly that. To say, look, you think you're going back to something that was before, but you're actually not. It just got more complex, and you should pay more attention to that. So it's going to be really interesting part, and we're not going to talk about the mental wave because we're at the end of our time. So therefore, I say, Jenny, thank you so much for your time, for your insights, and for really great conversation.
Thank you so much. I loved it. It's great to see you both.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.